This is a reading from the Gospel according to John. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I want to welcome you again here to Harvard Divinity School. We are so pleased and honored to have the Academy of Preachers here at Harvard, and I mean that in both senses, both the association, the national organization, the Academy of Preachers, but also in the more maybe organic or everyday sense of this academy, this gathering of folks, all you preachers who are here to preach today and to practice this craft and to practice this art. It really is a pleasure. And this campus will be graced by your words in the next 25 or so hours. So I wanted to, apart from welcoming you here today, which has already happened, I also wanted to talk about preaching, about the task of preaching. And I mean that in both senses of that phrase as well. Our task when we come to preach, but also preaching's task, what preaching is meant to do for the world and for the church, and how we're supposed to conceive of that, and how we're supposed to undertake that. And I'm also going to try to relate it to this gospel passage, which I selected for today. As you can tell from my vestments, I come from a liturgical tradition, and it is our custom in my church to have our readings given to us, which I make a lot of hay about how awful that is, how I have to preach from texts that the church gives me, and I don't get to choose my own texts. But I tell you what, when you have to choose your own text, that is hard. To have all of Scripture before you, and to say what passage speaks to the day, what passage speaks to the event. And so I chose this one. It was one of the ones already suggested by the Academy of Preachers. I was thankful for that. And I have to be honest, the reason I chose it is because I'm doing a wedding tomorrow. And I said, I may as well choose this one. That'll be the place I'll start. But as I thought about this passage more, thought about this story more, the story from the beginning of Jesus' ministry more, it occurred to me that maybe this is the perfectly appropriate passage, or an appropriate passage for the beginning of this festival. There are a lot of elements from the story which will be recognizable to us if we're familiar with the ministry of Jesus and the stories of Jesus. Jesus is in Cana of Galilee, which is Gentile territory. This is the land of the outsiders. Not just outsiders. I was doing some reading, and evidently Cana was one of the roughest places in Galilee. There were brigands and thieves, and it had to be sort of kind of run over by the police state every so often to kind of settle things down. So Jesus is in this rough area of town. He's with the outsiders, and that's something we see over and again in the life and ministry of Jesus. And we also see these jars, these huge jars for the Jewish rites of purification. And we can hear something in that about Jesus taking up our religious traditions and transforming them, giving them new life. I want to bracket the 2,000-year history of sort of anti-Semitic interpretations of the Gospel of John, not because they're unimportant, but because they're too important for me to adequately address here. But one thing we can say is that Jesus did this. He takes up our religion and gives it new life. And so these are very recognizable things in the story of Jesus that we see in this story too. What I want to point to is what is unrecognizable, at least to me, in the story. When we think about Mary and Jesus, we think about this perfect mother-son relationship, right? The Holy Family. And here we have Jesus as the surly teenager. Mary says to him, they're out of wine. And he says, really abruptly, sort of unkindly, what's that got to do with me? Mom, right? And this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of John. This petulance is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It's foundational in some sense. It begins what Jesus was called to do. And we compare it with other Gospels, and we see how dramatic this difference is. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' first act in his ministry is an exorcism, of course. Right? In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus returns home and goes to the synagogue to begin his ministry. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus preaches, perhaps especially appropriate. I should have chosen that lesson maybe. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus complains and resists, and it's at a wedding. And what's more, it's this sort of private miracle. Almost no one knows what happened, except his mother and him and a couple of the servants and us. It's a secret, and it's hesitant. How are we to make sense of this as the beginning of a ministry? Well, the theme of our festival this year, and the festivals all over the country, is Tell Me a Story. So I'm going to tell you a story about the beginning of my ministry. I serve a church on Cape Cod, and I'm doing a wedding there tomorrow. And we do a fair number of weddings at this church. We're fairly close to the water, so a lot of people want to come have weddings there. But we also sort of resist that a little bit. We believe marriage is an expression of the community, and so we try to sort of be gatekeepers for people who just want to use us as a wedding chapel or whatever. And we have different strategies for doing that, but sometimes things happen, right? So in my first year down at my church, which is called St. Barnabas, son of encouragement, that means in Greek. My first year down there, I got a call from another minister in town, and she said, as I received her call, she said, I have to run home for a family emergency. I'm marrying this couple on the beach this weekend. I meant to do it. Can you do that for me? Can you perform this wedding? Now look at the way I'm dressed. I don't like to do weddings on the beach. You can probably guess, right? But she was in a bind, and so I said yes. Even though this wedding happened to be taking place during the Notre Dame-Michigan game. I went to Notre Dame for college. This is an important day, but I said, you're in trouble. I'll be happy to help you out. And so I did, and she gave me the phone number of the groom, and I called him up. And, I don't expect people to call me Father Matt or Reverend Matt, but he called me Guy. He's like, hey, Guy, thanks for calling. And I did not feel good about doing this wedding. And I remember that Saturday, sitting on my couch, almost in this outfit, waiting to go to the service and watching Notre Dame lose, and thinking, I do not want to go to this service. And I drove over to the beach, and when I showed up, there was a groom, and he had his sunglasses on. He said, hey, Guy, thanks for coming. And there was a CD player playing some sort of awful music on the beach. And so I was resisting this. I was hesitant there, and I stood there, and I waited as the guests showed up, and then the bride came, and the bride walked up and faced her soon-to-be husband. And I will confess to you that I have never prayed the prayers of that prayer book with less earnestness or enthusiasm than I did that day. I was saying the words. I was doing what I needed to do. And as I whispered those vows and waited for the bride and the groom to speak them aloud back to me, and more importantly, back to each other, I saw that the bride had tears in her eyes, and she was beginning to weep. And I saw that this groom had tears in his eyes, and he was beginning to weep. And I felt suddenly humbled and graced that I, a complete stranger to these folks, was invited to share in the most important day in their lives. Now, I'm not comparing myself to Jesus or my ministry to Jesus. I wouldn't hope to do that. But in my years as a minister, it continually astounds me how routinely I, as a stranger, am called to share in the most sacred moments of people's lives. At bedside, in the hospital, at graveside, beside fonts. And sometimes I don't want to go. Sometimes I don't want to go because the groom calls me Guy. Sometimes I don't want to go because I'm worried that I don't have enough to give, or someone I care about is dying or has died, and I'm not sure what I have to offer. But when I go, I find in all these places that I am graced to witness the love of God in the lives of everyday people. And I think preaching fits this metaphor as well. Preaching fits this analogy as well. Because we're asked to take up two things, these tangled texts, these complicated tangled texts, in our broken world, and we are asked to stand in pulpits and say some good news about those things. And sometimes I want to resist that. Because what can these tangled texts say about our world? What do these tangled texts say about Ferguson, Missouri? Or what can I say about Ferguson, Missouri? What do these tangled texts have to say about ISIS? Or what do they have to say about a toddler with brain cancer? The things that we see in our everyday lives but maybe don't get as much press coverage as Ferguson, Missouri, or ISIS. What do these texts have to say? But when we accept that fear, we embrace that resistance, but we move forward. And when we take up everyday things as common as stone jars and a couple of gallons of water, everyday things like our little minds and our little lives, and pen and paper, and prayer and study, and we walk up into that pulpit, we find that we are graced to witness the love of God in these everyday lives. And that, I think, is the courage preaching demands and the task of preaching in both those senses. The things that makes it so challenging to stand up in the pulpit, but the thing which also makes standing up in the pulpit so crucial for our world. Because this is what we have to say to the world, that it is broken, and our texts and traditions are tangled. But there is good news in the love of our everyday lives. And this is why I think in this particular story, it may be that the hero, at least for us preachers, is not Jesus, but Mary. Because Mary makes two appearances in the Gospel of John. Here, when she asks her son to be a minister and is scolded, and the second time at the foot of his cross, when he gives her away. When Mary calls her son into ministry, she is calling him towards the cross. And I don't believe that she's pie-eyed about this when she says this to him, when she says to her son, begin your ministry. But she has seen his goodness, and she has seen his holiness. And in response, there is nothing she can do except speak up for and to Jesus Christ. And that's what we as preachers are also called to do, to speak up to and for Jesus Christ from these pulpits.